And live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Monday's edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour brought to you by Effective Artistry. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I have been trained by Brandon Tessers, LCPC, who is here to answer your questions today about neurodiversity, mental health, and more. But as the title says, this is not therapy. It's an open conversation with Brandon, so a chance for you to pick Brandon's brain, ask questions. I'm here as well to represent you, the audience, so I will ask your questions if you pop them in the chat. Just bear in mind if you're joining us, whether it's on Twitch or Facebook or YouTube, if you post a message in the chat, it will come up with your name. So just bear that in mind when you're popping any comments or questions to us. A little bit about Effective Artistry. It's a therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. And it's a neurodiversity affirming practice. So if you identify as neurodivergent and you want to work with a neurodivergent therapist, you can contact Effective Artistry through the website and set up a 20-minute consultation with Brandon to discuss your support needs. I have been working remotely as a coach with Effective Artistry since last summer, and I'm an executive functioning coach. I'm based in the UK. I think that's everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Every week I go, I think that's everything, and I always feel like I missed something.
That's kind of how I've always wrapped it up too, is just, did I miss something or whatever? Yeah, I did want to make sure to mention that today is a little unusual. One of my middle child, Augie, woke up with his eye looking kind of funny today. So my wife is taking him to the doctor and dropping off the baby, Rex, with me in about 15 minutes. So in about 15 minutes or so, I'll have to step away for a few minutes to pick him up, and then he'll be hanging out with us for the rest of the stream.
Yay!
Hopefully it works out. If not, I might have to duck out and call this early, but we'll see how it goes. This is like,
so I'm gonna have to vamp for a bit.
Yeah, or give your thoughts.
Yeah, if you are joining us, feel free to shoot me lots of questions and help me vamp for 5 minutes while Brandon is glad to get Rex. It'll be really nice to meet Rex. Yay!
Yeah. This is, it's around when he's usually going down for an afternoon nap, so I think that it will be. I think it'll work out okay because he should be pretty chill and just kind of want to hang out in my lap, but we will see.
Cool.
All right. Full screen last time. It was the first time I'd ever done that before, and I don't remember how I did it. Oh, well, doesn't matter.
What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. Today's topic is sort of a continuation on last week's one, because I feel like we could talk about intelligence as a concept forever. But a few other really interesting things came up in the conversation last week that I'd love to explore further with you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about your previous experience. You mentioned working with the Center for Identity Potential last week. So I thought this week we could talk a little bit more about the concept of giftedness and twice exceptionality, 2E for short. It's something that I'm seeing more of on social media. It's something that's being discussed more often. But I think maybe it's something that we should break down for our viewers and listeners.
It's a fun one to talk about.
Yeah,
I'm excited. Let's do it.
All right. Well, let's start with the basics as usual. What is giftedness?
So giftedness as a term is just a way of describing people being high intelligence. You might get different specific, some people will specifically focus on high IQ, which IQ is a particular metric that's intended to measure intelligence. Some people will talk about high intellectual ability or high various different ways of referring to it. But it means if someone is gifted, it means that you're saying that they have a greater intellectual ability, greater intelligence, which I'm, stumbling over a little bit because I think there's all kinds of problems with that concept and how we define it. And that's a lot of what we were talking about last week. But that's what it means when we're referring to gifted people, giftedness. It's just a euphemism for intelligent.
Okay. So there's I'm guessing there's no one way to measure giftedness then, since there's no one way to measure intelligence.
No, not really. But giftedness is I was going to say almost exclusively used, and I shouldn't say that. It's not exclusive or even close to being exclusive, but it's primarily intended to be used in the academic setting. Mm-hmm. Mostly as a way to like allocate resources, right? So schools will have gifted programs, for example, that you have to get into. And for that reason, any school district or any organization that has services allocated to gifted individuals will have some clearly defined way of identifying those people. That sometimes is IQ tests, that sometimes is scores on other tests. In the United States, each state has its own kind of like mandated standardized tests. Often those things will be used. So anybody in particular who's talking about giftedness is generally referring to academics, and generally there is some specific way of measuring it for whatever that area or region or whatever it is. But definitely there's no universally accepted, this is the way to look at it.
I have a very vague recollection of doing SATs, I think, in primary school, what you'd call grade school or middle school. Maybe I was probably middle school age, so around 11 or 12.
Yeah,
and scoring really highly in one and not so much in the other.
Yeah. Well, then you might be, we're potentially identified as twice exceptional. We'll get to. Yeah. And just so that anybody, there are a million different acronyms for all these different tests, and SAT is a particularly confusing one because the SAT, the big famous one, is a college readiness test that high schoolers take before applying for colleges. But there are also SATs that are stand for different things. It depends on what maybe there's a particular one, but I don't know. That are things like that are meant to measure at the grade level, like who's on or above grade reading level or grade math level, etc.
Yeah, I think maybe it's different education systems. It's probably the same name, but
we do the same. There are some tests, SAT tests, that kids will take in grade school here. It's just a same acronym for a different set of words. And I don't know about there or elsewhere, but in the States, testing is huge. We've talked in the past about the difficulties of scaling things up and needing to be able to apply things in kind of consistent ways. Well, testing is the thing in education in the United States, because grades are, a teacher or a professor can just give you an A for whatever reason they deem in many places with very little oversight. Grades typically aren't looked at as valid of a metric. Whereas tests, everybody all over the country can take the same test. So there are upsides and downsides to that. That the people who are in favor of a lot of testing will talk about it as kind of an equalizer, right? That a kid who goes to a school without a lot of resources can't really compete with a kid who goes to a school with a ton of money floating around. But on a test, the kid in the rural area or wherever can still outscore the kid from the rich area. I don't know how much these things correlate with income and all kinds of, but whatever. Testing is big. It's how a lot of things like resources are allocated to schools and school districts based on their test scores. You can get put into different categories, including having schools kind of shut down or taken over if test scores drop into certain categories, things like that.
But then testing is sort of a snapshot in time as well. It's about your ability to regurgitate information on a given day, and it doesn't take into account a whole bunch of other stuff, like how you're feeling that day.
Sure. Depending on the testing. So anyone who's really fully honest about testing will say that any given test only measures the ability to take that test at the time and in the context in which the individual is taking it. And obviously, if we really talked about it that way, they would be pretty useless. So we're doing them because people think that there is a way to generalize those results to something else. And different tests are different. Some are very much just memorize and regurgitate information. Those tend to be like the classroom type tests. So those tests are designed with the hope of every student being able to ace them, right? That when a teacher is giving a test on a unit or a chapter or whatever, they would love for each student to be able to get every single question right. Standardized testing doesn't work that way. because standardized testing is comparative. If everybody took the SAT or the ACT and everybody got every single question right, it would be a useless test. Because standardized testing is not intended to be a measure of achievement or learning or anything like that. It is intended to be a way of ranking people against each other.
Yeah.
Whatever particular thing it is that they're looking at, the point of that thing is to be able to compare people or districts or classrooms to other people or districts or classrooms. So they are intentionally, deliberately designed in such a way that it should, theoretically, what they're aiming for is a normal distribution of results, the bell curve that, most people get within 33% either way, within one standard deviation of the mean and blah, 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 whatever that is. IQ tests are designed this way. Mm-hmm. I just think most people's experience with tests, or at least the first thing they'll go to, is classroom tests, which you study for and whatever. And that's a very different thing than the kind of test that's intended to say this person is better in this way than this other person by X amount.
Right.
It's very relevant to what if we're talking about giftedness and twice exceptionality, all of this stuff is comparative. Yeah. So we got to make sure that we're clear about this. When we say someone is gifted, yes, we're referring to their intellectual ability or intelligence or whatever, but we're also saying as compared to the other kids around them or the average or whatever, etc.
So what are the pros and cons of identifying somebody as gifted in the classroom? I guess it's resource dependent, right? What happens?
Yeah, well, so that's some fun things, right? Mm-hmm. Not so fun. They sound terrible. And I'll say that this, like anything, it's valid. It has its validity. It's useful. It's not a terrible, terrible thing. And like everything else, it is limited and has elements of it which are terrible or harmful. And I'm going to focus probably more on the second category because that's the stuff that's less well known and therefore I think more worth us talking about. It doesn't mean that the first stuff isn't there, right? That like I was in gifted programs and I really enjoyed my gifted programs and had a great time. This isn't about gifted educators are bad people or anything like that. It's about the system and how it applies to us. So having said all that, upsides and downsides of giftedness. Yeah, where it started is the first federal funding for gifted education in the United States came from a defense spending. So this kind of ties in with the intelligence stuff we were talking about last week, that the first time someone used the term gifted to refer to a person, their intelligence, was in a eugenicist book. Not a book by a eugenicist, a book which argued that you could break people down into 4 categories and only people from the top 2 categories should be allowed to procreate. And gifted was the second highest category. Preeminent was the highest category. This kind of stuff was really big in the late 19th century. Like phrenology was around that time too, especially in the United States. And there's some pretty obvious connections you can draw about why people would be so desperate to find some way of ranking people inherently based on cognitive or emotional or intellectual ability, saying that it's tied to biology and that therefore different people are suited to different types of lives and tasks and whatever. That's where it started. Now, if you go look for like the origins of gifted education, you won't find that kind of stuff because he wasn't talking about education. That's just the first time somebody used that term referring to intelligence. It was the early 20th century that people started talking about gifted education, meaning the idea that if someone is different from the norm in this way, in some significant way regarding their intelligence being higher, then theoretically we would want the process of their education to be different as well in order to kind of differentiate and match it. Same way that we have what usually gifted education, by the way, is technically considered special education.
Yeah.
Colloquially speaking, when people refer to special education, they typically mean people with greater needs or lesser intellectual ability than the average. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of a similar thing that if we're going to differentiate for people on that side, we should differentiate on the other side. It was a relatively niche kind of cause for a few decades. There wasn't a lot going behind it until the 1940s and 50s. This is my fun history lesson moment. In particular, the arms race of the Cold War, post-World War II. So World War II, there was a lot of stuff, and people know a lot of these stories about basically the war was kind of thought to be defined by who could have the better weapons, and the better weapons were developed by the smartest people. There's reasons that, you know, a lot of Nazi scientists ended up working for the United States government after the fact. And I mean, if people don't know the stories of people like Einstein or Oppenheimer or Turing, the big British one, there, in many kind of circles, this was the first time that government and military was starting to think of intelligence as A, a thing that exists at all, and B, a thing that can be used to leverage a competitive kind of thing, that some people have more, and that if you use it in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. So after World War II and all that fun stuff, terrible stuff, sorry, I'm distracted because I'm trying to make sure that when that call comes, I got to run down to the parking lot, and I'm like so nervous I'm going to miss it.
Don't worry.
The arms race of the Cold War, and particularly Sputnik, when the Russians put a satellite into space. So, fun thing about intelligence. Think about ancient Greece, and think about the most intelligent people in ancient Greece. What did they do? And it's just your stereotypes, it's your generalizations, it's our generalizations. But what are you thinking about? You're probably philosophers, writers, orators, maybe politicians. No scientists, engineers, mathematics, none of that. Artists. Think of Renaissance Italy. What do you think of with the most intelligent people? Hold on, I think this is it. You here? All right, I'll be right there. I will be back in a few minutes.
All right. Okay, folks. Gonna need your help here. I'm gonna have to do some editing on this video. If you're joining us in the chat, please shoot your questions to me. I am going to put a little reminder on Twitter that we're here. I am looking forward to getting into this conversation today. We're going to talk a little bit about giftedness in the classroom. My background is as an eternal student. So I'm on a break from a PhD right now, but I've spent the last 11, 12 years working in an academic setting. So I work in a university here in the UK. I returned to university as a mature student. I completed a degree in plant and soil science, and then started a PhD during the pandemic. And I worked in an academic library environment throughout that time. So I have some thoughts about how we approach neurodiversity and giftedness in a university environment setting, environment or setting. Hello. But I'm keen to hear about Brandon's experience working with neurodivergent young people as well. Welcome back. That was just a minute, if even.
This is Rex. I wasn't sure how smoothly it would go. She had him already out of the thing. Yeah. We'll see how this goes. Here, you want to play with this? We'll do our best, but he's usually pretty chill. Not always, but he's a good guy.
He's a happy kid.
Yeah, so the point I was getting at is that intelligence being linked to STEM specifically, it originates in that kind of World War II, post-World War II. It was it was a deliberate effort on the part of the United States government in particular. Basically, they were being beaten in the arms race, and they were looking for ways to get back in it or take the lead or whatever. And so with this concept of intelligence, which was a relatively novel and not very well spread concept at that time, the theory then became, well, some people are just naturally better suited to being creative and developing things. So then the question was, how do we A, identify those people, and B, how do we make sure that those people then get funneled into building new and better weapons for us? So the first federal funding for the identification and education of gifted people came in the Defense Act of It's either 52, 56, or 62. I think it's 56, maybe 58. I get it. I lose track of the specific date. For that reason. And that's when STEM became a thing. Another fun little factoid, the word scientist was modeled after the word artist. What we now call scientists these days were originally called natural philosophers. There was no word scientist for a long time. And eventually the word scientist was proposed by an artist as a person who does art is called an artist. A person who does science is called a scientist. Art came first, obviously, and it, blah, blah, blah. Whatever. Yes, hello.
So it's like thinking and observing and then manipulating.
What's that?
Thinking, observing, and then manipulating of the environment.
Yeah.
Really, really simplistic take on it.
Yeah. So yeah, there was a concerted effort to identify intelligent people, especially the younger you can identify them, the better, and then funnel them into STEM fields as early and efficiently as possible so that they could develop new and better technology for everybody else. So I know this is a big, long, winding path, but talking about upsides and downsides, I think it's worth noting that the original upsides, no, that's the power strip. The intent was for the public good in a sense. It wasn't initially necessarily conceived. And of course, the people who were doing this work, the educators who had been pioneering it, it wasn't invented when the federal government started to get involved. And the people who had been doing it were, of course, very focused on the good of the individual students, the children, as educators generally are. But as it became scaled up and turned into a system, the thought was we need to leverage these resources. Intelligent people were thought of as a resource for the community, and we needed to leverage them better. So that was the intended upside, was for society to get more use out of our most intelligent individuals. Now, how it affects the individual person or the classroom or the educator, all of these things are different. That's okay. You can turn that one on and off. So I guess maybe it would help if we kind of identified upsides and downsides in what category, and then we can get more specific.
I guess what are the upsides for educators in being able to identify gifted people in the classroom? What are the upsides for the individual of being singled out as gifted?
There is a concept called differentiation in education, which just means that no matter what we want to say about intelligence and giftedness and IQ and all these things, there are observable differences between people, right? None of this is to deny that some people respond to different stimuli in different ways. Some people are better at taking tests in a broad general sense than other people are. Some people are better at learning information and being able to access it more rapidly than other people in an academic environment. It depends on how we define information. So there do exist some differences, and differentiation is unquestionably an upside in terms of the actual education, right? The technical, we call pedagogy, like the science of education and instruction, of teaching someone. It is very useful. If we were going to, for example, gather a random group of people, which is effectively what schools are, not random, but based on geography, right? If we were to say, these 3 neighborhoods, we're going to take all the kids and we're going to teach them all how to play basketball. Well, some of those kids are going to show up already knowing how to play basketball and being very advanced. Some of them will never have heard of the term before. And so it suits us, it benefits us to separate out, to start with, okay, who's heard of basketball? Because we're not going to waste your time with teaching you the basics. Who knows how to dribble? Who knows, etc. So that we can target the education to the people for whom it is relevant. If you teach people things that are too far outside of their capability, then it's not only pointless, but makes everyone feel bad. If you teach people things that they already know how to do or have mastered, then it's pointless and makes everyone feel bad. So we're aiming for that zone of proximal development I've mentioned before as a concept from Lev Vygotsky, big in pedagogy. So anyway, differentiation is good. It has cost, right? Like we need a different teacher and a different lesson plan and a different classroom and different, et cetera. But it'd be pretty hard to argue that there's not value in differentiation, in teaching different people different levels, right? So that's one of the upsides, because one of the downsides of being gifted and not having access to gifted resources, or to be clear, there's a lot of controversy over whether gifted programs should even exist. And there are upsides and downsides to both sides. I'll be clear, I'm not trying to hedge that I actually think that gifted programs should not exist. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that different children are served best by different types of experiences. Yeah. It's just that the things that are necessitated by gifted programs, like the gatekeeping involved in determining who gets in and who doesn't. Because as opposed to other special education programs where people don't necessarily want to be involved, who doesn't want to be told that they or their child is more intelligent than everybody else and therefore gets special, fun, cool activities and whatever, right? Yeah. So all kinds of problems with it. I got distracted. This is an extra challenge of trying to be a somewhat attentive father while also tracking the 8 million points I usually put out. What were we talking about there? Oh, differentiation. Oh, and the cost associated with it. Yeah. So that's one of the problems with gifted programs, is that resources have to be spent on these programs, but only certain people have access. And another part of the problem with intelligence, like we were talking about last week, we didn't mention this particular thing, but there's something called the Goodman effect. I think it's the Goodman effect. The Cobra effect is the colloquial term for it. That once you select something as a measure, it ceases to have its utility as a measure. Meaning, if what we're trying to measure is intelligence, and the metrics, because we can't really measure intelligence, so we come up with a metric that we call IQ, and we have reason to believe theoretically that IQ does, I don't believe this necessarily, but theoretically we have reason to believe that IQ does correlate to intelligence. Well, as soon as we select IQ as the measure, there is now incentive for people to do things that will get their IQ higher, even if those things don't result in higher intelligence.
Oh, so like extra tuition or...
Right. Yeah. So we break, as soon as we select a measure, we break the inherent correlation. People are incentivized to do things that will get their SAT scores up, even if that doesn't make them more college ready, where theoretically the SAT score is meant to be a measure of college readiness.
Right.
And of course, that's always going to tilt towards people with more resources. If there's incentive to do a thing well, then somebody is going to find ways to optimize for that. And there's incentive for that person to sell services, to be able to, et cetera, et cetera. I used to be a test tutor. You get a lot of money for not a lot of qualifications other than that you do well on tests.
So I could see a downside immediately in being identified or singled out as gifted if the resources aren't there.
Well,
then you just feel, okay, I'm different.
Yeah.
But I don't know what this means.
That downside doesn't necessarily rely on identification, right? Like if you feel different from everyone else, if you feel like the things in class seem to come easily to you and everything's moving really slow and you get so bored and whatever, whether you're identified as gifted or not. And notice, by the way, that a lot of this stuff we're talking about could also be talked about as signs of being neurodivergent or having ADHD or being autistic, because at the root, they're the same thing. We're identifying that a person is different, specifically in the way in which they engage with cognition or utilize cognition.
Yeah.
The way they think about and perceive things is significantly different in some way that impacts them. The difference, of course, is that when we're talking about intelligence or giftedness, we just mean we think it's a good difference. And generally, pre-neurodiversity, when we're talking about learning disabilities, we're talking about things that we think are a bad difference.
Right.
Which is where twice exceptionality came in. But yeah.
Talk a bit about that then.
Well, so twice exceptionality is a developmental concept, meaning it builds on what came before, and it's better than what came before, but it's still limited in and of itself. And I think of neurodiversity as kind of being the next step onward from twice exceptionality. So one of the downsides of being, we didn't talk too much yet about the upsides and downsides of being identified as gifted. Some of the downsides include things like that no one takes your problems seriously. You're smart, and so the fact that you're struggling, because people tend to, like we were talking about last week, attribute everything to intelligence. And since you are intelligent, it should therefore in their minds be easy for you to do basically anything. So whenever you struggle, they got to come up with something else, like laziness, or you just don't care, or you're scattered, or whatever other thing. So when people then are going for support or trying to explain their difficulties, and everyone's saying, well, like, this is a very common experience for people who have tried to get identified as ADHD or autistic, but more commonly in ADHD, is that you go in to get assessed and people say, well, you got good grades, you can't have ADHD.
Yep.
So very real life example of, because you have a high IQ or good grades, your struggles therefore cannot have existed. So you get written off, you get told you should be capable of doing anything and everything all by yourself, because if you don't know how to do it, well, you're smart, you figure it out. You're smart, figure it out. It's literally a thing that gets said to people all the time.
Yeah, or having lots of potential, but not living up to that
Potential is a terrible, terrible concept, because potential means something you are not currently doing.
Yeah.
Don't look at something you're doing and say, wow, great potential. If someone is talking to you about potential, they're saying things that they think you should be able to do or are capable of doing that would be valuable to do, but that you are not currently doing. It's not a compliment. I know people tend to think of it as, and they want it to be, but it's not received that way. It's a big part of the former gifted kid syndrome kind of stuff. Yeah. You're right.
So you see neurodiversity as a step forward, even from.
Well, so twice exceptionality, to define it, is twice exceptionality means you are exceptional in two different ways, meaning one up, one good one, you're gifted, and one down, a bad one, you have a learning disability. So if you are identified as gifted and ADHD, we would call you twice exceptional, right?
Okay.
Or gifted and autistic, or gifted and dyslexic, or whatever. The one of the exceptionalities always has to be gifted. The other one is anything that would theoretically inhibit your success academically. So learning disabilities. Generally, if people are talking about twice exceptional, they don't mean gifted and depressed, for example.
No.
They would consider that being on a different spectrum, which right away tells you a lot about how people tend to view things like ADHD and autism, that they think it's on the other end of the same spectrum from intelligent, which it is not.
No.
This is a big part of why things like ABA are so problematic, is because they're looked at as these people are less intelligent, less capable, and we need to be treating them that way. Where really, if you're neurodivergent, you're probably thinking more than the average person at the expense of acting less or having less control over your actions compared to the normal person, because those both draw on the same resource. But we're getting into my theories, and that's not necessarily widely accepted. So that's twice exceptional. It means you can have some good stuff and some bad stuff on the same, because what are you going to do? You identify your kid as gifted, or your kid gets identified as gifted. They still have problems. And if you're attentive, it's one thing to like know of a child or work with children that say they're gifted and struggling and write them off. If it's your kid and you're paying attention and you see them struggling, no matter how hard they try and whatever, sooner or later, you're going to say, no, this isn't just a matter of they're not trying hard enough or whatever. So they develop the concept of twice exceptionality. You can be gifted and have a learning disability. Neurodiversity is better because the truth is that everybody has a completely unique profile. It's not like most people are normal, some are gifted, some are learning disabled, and some are both. 4 categories of people, Everyone is completely unique. And such thing as, if we were going to use the twice exceptional model, which is not a terrible model, but it has plenty of problems and limitations, there's no such thing as a person who's gifted without also some form of learning disability or something else on the other side. That's just not how it works. You cannot be more intelligent than everyone else, and that comes at no cost. you are thinking more. What are you doing less of in exchange for that thinking? Anyway, I know I'm scattered. Was that the answer to the question we were talking about?
That is the answer to the question. And the phrase that keeps coming up, and I think it's a book or that you've recommended to, Smart but Scattered or Smart but Stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, Smart but Scattered is a good book. It's it's a whole line of books by Peg Dawson and Richard Guar, who are, Peg Dawson's like the biggest name in executive functioning, the concept of executive functioning. So Smart but Scattered is kind of one of the seminal texts talking about executive functioning. Because again, from the 50s to the, we'll say, late 80s, early 90s, everything had kind of been said, intelligence is good, unintelligent is bad. And it wasn't until kind of the mid-late 80s that people started being like, well, hey, wait a second now. Even though some people are intelligent, they still don't successfully complete tasks that we would assume are beneficial, you know? And so they started looking for other things. And that's part of where executive functioning, in the way that most people know of it, started. The actual concept, the original concept of executive functioning is different. But the idea of like organization and goal-directed behavior and emotional regulation, all that kind of stuff that people are talking about came from that same kind of twice exceptionality stuff of how can people be smart but still struggle.
I think it's very easy to sort of downplay or disregard the extent of that struggle. Because as you say, if you're smart, then what's the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, if we say that another problem with saying that intelligence should solve all the problems is that for someone to acknowledge even to themselves that they're struggling with something means that they have to say that they're dumb. Is something that still is a problem. Obviously, neurodiversity or not, pretty much everybody I work with, you feel bad having to say, I don't know how to do this thing. Right? Like most people don't feel, especially the former gifted kids, neurodivergent people generally, there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. Because you've been identified as your value, at least in part, but in many cases, pretty much all of it is tied to your intelligence, your ability to figure things out. So saying you don't know something, you don't know how to do something, you need help with something, makes you feel completely valueless. I mean, it's similar to that imposter syndrome we were talking a little while back. It's like, if I say I don't know, that means I have no value. It means that the value people find in you is your knowledge of things.
So it can be incredibly debilitating when you hit that wall, however that wall manifests for you.
Yeah, well, just if you're told a story your whole life of how things work and what makes humans human and what you should be and should feel and should be capable of, and etc., and then your experience is different than that, it's going to cause distress. Yeah. And this is a particular version of that happening that's more common more recently than some of the others. But there's a million, you know, the kid who's told that he's going to be in the NFL his whole life and then doesn't get recruited to college is going to go through a similar kind of identity crisis of, I thought this was my value, now I don't have it. The cheerleader who's told that she's beautiful and that's her whole thing that she's praised for, when she gets old and loses that beauty, is going to start to struggle. So it's just a story that you're told, watch out, about your value.
Yeah, I see a lot of pushback on social media about the meme of the formerly gifted kid to late diagnosed autistic pipeline. That's the phrase as it goes around, and I see a lot of pushback against that, saying,
I do too.
You don't really have problems. You're smart. You're just trying to find problems that don't exist because you want to be seen different or quirky or whatever.
I'm just going to say, when we were talking about neurodiversity a while back, does that sound like neurodiversity affirming, is to say that being neurodivergent and being intelligent are mutually exclusive? Right. Like, in what way could you argue that you are then not stating that being neurodivergent is a deficit? Yeah. It's right back to people enforcing the medical model, even while using the neurodiversity terminology, is to say you are or are not. You don't know. People are what they identify as in this regard. Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of.
We should do it. We should do it. An episode on self-diagnosis at some point. I think that would be fun.
That would be fun. I have a very strong belief on this, and I don't think that there's really a reasonable argument on the other side. unless you are relying on the medical model, which is the antithesis of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
It's that biological determinism. It's still, even if you could argue that, oh, I'm saying intelligence and neurodiversity or neurodivergence are mutually exclusive, but I'm not saying that intelligence is good or neurodivergence is bad, which is a very specious claim, because most of the people who are saying this are saying you don't qualify because you haven't struggled enough, which does imply that they think intelligence is good and neurodivergence is bad. But even if you made that claim, you're still arguing that we can lock people into categories in some observably identifiable way, unrelated to a person's internal subjective experience and self-report. That's still biological determinism. And you're locking yourself away from resources.
Right.
Like if you're neurodivergent and someone who is also identifies as neurodivergent, and like, let's not make it an if thing. Many people who are former gifted kids, you know, that kind of stereotype, but also an actual identity, an actual thing that happens to people, are finding value in identifying as neurodivergent. Then if you are neurodivergent, but not identified in that way as being a gifted kid, former gifted kid, wouldn't you want access to, if there's this much overlap, maybe there are some things that people talk about as being related to giftedness that might be helpful to me. If I can just, it's kind of the same as if you say, oh, I have ADHD, but I'm not autistic, and therefore you don't consider anything that's discussed in that's helpful potentially to autistic people. You're like, oh, irrelevant data to me.
Yeah.
And then one day you're like, well, maybe I should look into it. Oh, actually, this does match my experience. Same thing with giftedness. It's just another label.
Right.
It has different upsides and downsides, but the core experience is really not that different for most people.
Mm-hmm.
The core subjective internal experience. Sorry, I'm all kinds of all over the place. buddy. What were we talking about? Neurodiversity, twice exceptionality.
Oh yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background. Then you mentioned before that you worked at with the Center for Identity Potential.
Yeah,
I wanted to ask how that shaped your views and with it to effective artistry.
Brief kind of bio. So I was identified as a gifted kid. Academics was always easy for me. I mean, people who watch this stream probably, regardless of my thoughts about the nature of intelligence and what that word and concept means, generally people look at me and think of me as smart. It's a lot of what people identify my value as being, that I'm a smart guy, an intelligent guy. So it's an experience that I had and knew, and of course had my struggles. This is part of why I'm so convinced that neurodivergence and intelligence are so linked, is because it's been my experience. And the things that I bring to this and the work that I do that people find so valuable, or at least sometimes find so valuable, is rooted in that experience. But anyway, when I like I said, I did a test prep tutoring for a while there in college because my test scores were always great. And that's really the only qualification you need to get a job with like Kaplan or those places. Then you go in and you do their program and they see if you can actually stand up in front of a class and teach a lesson plan, which I actually did not do well at because they are very particular that you have to use their exact language and their exact processes, which is not something I'm great at doing. But ended up working with more like individual, like more, honestly, more expensive in-home, one-on-one individualized stuff, which is better suited to me, or which I'm better suited to anyway as a tutor. Watch your head. Duck. We'll just move the chair. How about that? That's a better solution. Got into executive functioning coaching. And then, like I've said before, doing that work is when it started to become clear that all of this stuff is interrelated and you can't address academics or anything like that separate from other things. But I didn't feel that it was ethically appropriate for me to do that work. So I went back and got my therapy degree. In my therapy program, it just so happened So I didn't even, at the time, I didn't know giftedness was a thing that was talked about in regards to adults. It was not on my radar. It's not something I had thought much about for years and years. But one of my professors, a woman by the name of Michelle Kane, Dr. Michelle Kane, who's wonderful, and she's done a lot of work in the realm of gifted education. So when it came time for me to be looking for internships, she put me in touch with Andy Mahoney at the Center for Identity Potential, because she identified me as an intelligent person, and we talked about experiences with gifted education and things. So Andy Mahoney was my mentor. I did 2 internships, one with him in private practice, but also one with a local government agency working different stuff. And then after graduation, went to work at the Center for Identity Potential. And it's hard. Yeah, that's your coat. Which, by the way, I'm going to have to, if his mom is not back, to pick, if you want to put it on and go outside, don't you? I might need to leave in a few minutes, actually, and take him over to the doctor's office down the street, because I have a 2:00 and I have to make sure. I didn't know if she'd be back to pick him up. It's really impossible to identify exactly in what ways Andy and the Center for Identity Potential influenced me. But I would say it's not nearly as much as people would probably assume in regards to content and specific beliefs. Yeah, I'm going to have to leave in a couple minutes here. Or even necessarily approach, although there is a lot of that. His work on identity was very interesting to me. It's more in general kind of attitude, I think, honestly. The way that Andy kind of approached this work. We're going to go in just a minute.
Okay.
Well, maybe we'll talk about this more some other time. But just the idea of, as opposed to this kind of rote learning, you learn what the book says and then do what the books say, getting into the reasoning behind things, why people recommend things in different ways, including the fact that a very empowering thing that somebody came up with these ideas. So why does that mean that anybody else's, including ours, are inherently not valid? I'm going to go and take this.
All right. Okay.
We'll talk more about
this up another time.
Marie.
Thank you for letting us meet Rex today. Thank you, Rex.
All right. If I leave the studio, can you end the broadcast, or do I need to end?
I can't end the broadcast, no.
Okay. Then we're ending the broadcast. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.